in a short period of time. To name a few: a secure border, a ceasefire between India and Pakistan, continued pressure on both the Russians and the Ukrainians to end the war, and the return of American hostages from the clutches of Hamas. You've instituted a return to the office for states' employees and a return to a merit-based hiring system, ensuring the department can deliver for the American people. And of course, the Trump administration has sought to overhaul our federal spending, cutting much of the waste and abuse. Main concentrations we have of the view is the fact that we're going upside down $1 trillion every 150 or so days. You've done all of these things while maintaining our strong presence abroad. This committee has worked hard in a bipartisan manner to approve 31 nominees for posts here and overseas to make sure you have the staff you need. And we continue to do so because you can't be everywhere at once, and the U.S. must have high-level representation on the world stage. This is important because we face threats from all across the globe. Actors from China to Russia, from North Korea to Iran have united in an authoritarian axis bent on weakening the United States. I believe China is America's greatest long-term competitor. But the previous administration treated China like an ally we disagreed with rather than an aggressor that takes advantage of America and our allies at every level. The Chinese government is fundamentally different from the United States. Where America promotes free markets and innovation, the CCP clamps down on businesses and steals American intellectual property. Where we believe that every person has God-given rights, the Chinese government commits genocide against Uyghurs and other minorities in China and harasses dissidents here in America. We want to work with you to ensure you have the tools you need to counter Chinese influence, including through the Development Finance Corporation and the Millennial Challenge Corporation. To truly counter China, we need to catalyze private sector growth worldwide where we can. As you know, China is not the only threat. Over the last decade, particularly in the last 3 years, Putin's aggression has created the largest security crisis in Europe since the Second World War. President Trump is working diligently to help end this conflict. We need to keep pushing our European allies to increase cooperation on security. Some have already boosted their defense spending to 5%, but many still need to take stronger steps to confront the threats they face from Russia. In the Middle East, even after the president's successful trip, tensions remain high. Hezbollah remains a disruptor to reform in Lebanon. Baghdad must work to disarm Iranian-backed militias. Israel remains under constant threat from Hamas and Iran's other proxies. And we all hope Syria's government lives up to the opportunity you and the president have given the country with sanctions relief. Meanwhile, the maximum pressure campaign this administration is reinstating on Iran is very promising. We stand a real chance at bringing greater stability to the Middle East. I know you and the president will continue this important work. Finally, I greatly appreciate President Trump's efforts to address long-standing issues with our foreign military sales process. Rebuilding our defense industrial base is critical to America's long-term national security, and FMS reform can play a vital role in that effort. However, I should note that many of the problems that plague the FMS process are the result of less than desirable policies and practices at the Department of Defense. It is in our interest to expand our defense production capacity and deliver needed capabilities to our allies. This committee has always worked closely with the administration on foreign military sales, and I know this will continue under your leadership. Secretary Rubio, as you and President Trump remake the State Department, I hope you'll consider this committee a partner and closely collaborate with us. As you bring the department into the 21st century through thoughtful reforms, I hope to finally see implementation of my Secure Embassies Construction Counterterrorism Act and Mission in a Box Act. These laws will help build new embassies easier, faster, and more cost-effectively, consequently freeing our personnel to conduct diplomacy abroad that advances American interests while better positioning the U.S. government to outcompete adversaries like China. Everyone who sits or has sat on this dais, including you, cares deeply about America's standing in the world. I look forward to hearing your vision for the ongoing State Department reorganization and how it will protect our national security interests. Thank you again for coming today. Again, a warm welcome, Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Rubio, welcome back. 4 months ago, you sat in that chair and you said that China is, quote, the most potent and dangerous near-peer adversary this nation has ever confronted. You called China an industrial competitor, an economic competitor, a geopolitical competitor, a scientific competitor. I believe you were right. And yet, this administration has eviscerated 6 decades of American foreign policy investments, undercutting our ability to compete with adversaries like China. And Beijing is not just sitting back. As Elon Musk took a chainsaw to USAID and you proposed cutting 83% of foreign assistance programs, China has promised increasing its diplomatic budget by 8.4%. As we move to reduce our diplomatic workforce and discuss closing U.S. embassies, China has more diplomatic missions than any other nation on earth. And as the U.S. canceled PEPFAR, our most successful program fighting HIV/AIDS, China has been happy to replace our global health efforts across Africa and Asia. As this administration distracts from serious national security issues with threats against Panama and Greenland, Xi Jinping has welcomed Brazil's president and other Latin American leaders pledging more than $9 billion in investments. And as the U.S. has shuttered Voice of America and Radio Free Asia and crippled the State Department's ability to counter foreign propaganda, China pours billions into propaganda, spreading lies and eroding trust in the U.S. As this administration imposes tariffs on our closest allies, China is courting them in Europe, in Asia, and in our own hemisphere. Beijing is making the case that they are, and the term they are using is frightening, they are a more reliable partner than the United States. And it's not just our allies. Xi is deep in ties with Putin, shielding the Russian economy from sanctions. Because of that, and because President Trump has given away our leverage, Putin doesn't feel pressure to agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine. And for all the administration's talk, for all Elon Musk's promises, according to reports, DOGE has not saved a dime. CBS News reports that the federal government has spent $200 billion more in its first 100 days than it did last year. And according to the Partnership for Public Service, DOGE's cuts might cost American taxpayers $135 billion this year. This is in addition to the costs to American families and businesses stemming from the president's trade war. I recently met with a New Hampshire company that provides ball bearings to the aerospace industry. They do a lot of their business with defense. Their lead time for steel has gone from 20 weeks to 2.5 years because of the tariffs on steel. We can't support our defense industry with a 2.5-year lead time on steel. According to the Yale Budget Lab, consumers face an overall tariff rate of 17.8%, which is the highest since 1934. That's $2,800 per household each year. And these tariffs amount to the largest tax increase during peacetime in U.S. history. 4 months ago, Mr. Secretary, you said we were going to be safer, stronger, and more prosperous. But whether it's President Trump's deals with the Sinaloa cartel to let cartel members into the United States, or watching masked agents abduct a Tufts college student, I don't feel safer. With Canadians canceling summer trips to New Hampshire and hurting our tourism industry, I don't feel more prosperous. And after traveling to Ukraine and visiting the graves of people who were massacred on the orders of a Russian president, this administration has bent over backwards to please, I don't feel more secure. To your credit, Mr. Secretary, your trip and the statement from President Trump that he will be lifting sanctions on Syria was welcome news. And you've worked to restart some programs and grant waivers to others. But contrary to what we've heard, life-saving health and humanitarian aid is still not flowing in any meaningful way. My staff was just in Africa. We have photos of the empty shelves and closed down clinics. We were promised a golden age for America, but instead our disease surveillance programs are down, our counterterrorism programs are in chaos, the ceasefire in Gaza has ended and fighting has begun again, and we have unilaterally disarmed against some of our most dangerous adversaries. You know, one of the things that I'll never forget in the past 4 months is my trip to Ukraine, where we stopped in Poland, which has been one of the most pro-American countries in the world. But because of the cuts and the stop work orders, we met with one civil society leader who was working with Ukrainian refugees. And he said to me, to the Codel, we always looked up to Americans. You are a trusted ally. My trust in America is broken. They were told to remove all the American flags with the halt on assistance to foreign assistance. Removing all the American flags is a sad commentary on the foreign assistance legacy for this administration. American flags coming down around the world. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Senator Shaheen, Secretary Rubio. There appears to be a modest disagreement in view of the condition today. It's your turn. Close the gap for us, please.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here on behalf of the National Archives, and in addition to...
Yeah. We don't have time for you to list.
Okay, well, we'll focus on state today. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. You know, when I came here 4 months ago, I told you that what I wanted was a State Department that was at the heart and soul of American foreign policy, that it was the single biggest driver both of action but also of ideas, and we're well on our way to achieving that. And the way I'll talk about some of the individual things we've accomplished during that time, but first let me explain sort of some of the processes by which we seek to arrive at it. The first is a reorganization of the way the State Department functions, and we have sort of previewed that with the committee and many of the individual members. Obviously, we'll have to come, we've taken input and are taking input now through the notice process, and then we'll come back to you with a formal congressional notification once. But we are taking a lot of the input, both provided by individual members and your staff, but also from inside the building. But if I could simplify, the goal is this, and that is...
Yeah, all right, first. Carry on.
The goal is to drive power and action in our agency to the regional bureaus and to our embassies on everything we do. We want our foreign policy to be holistic. So, for example, we recognize that the set of factors, both in diplomacy and foreign aid in Guatemala or in Trinidad or in Jamaica, are going to look different than they may somewhere in Africa, somewhere in the Indo-Pacific region. And we want those decisions and the influence over those decisions to be made, to be driven to the regional bureaus. And so what we've done is we've taken a lot of the functional bureaus and functional processes and moved them under the purview of the regional bureaus and the career individuals that serve there, and ultimately down to the embassy. One of our first tests, Senator Shaheen, is going to be in Syria. We don't have an embassy in Syria. It's operating out of Turkey. But we need to help them. We want to help that government succeed, because the alternative is full-scale civil war and chaos, which would, of course, destabilize the entire region. And we are going to allow our people on the ground, both our embassy personnel at the Damascus embassy located in Turkey, and for the short period of time, at least, or in the interim, our ambassador in Turkey, to work with local officials there to make determinations about what kind of aid they need. Is it humanitarian? Is it improving law enforcement or governance functions? We think it's going to be the first test of this new model, but I strongly believe that our decisions and the power to drive decisions and the decisions and the inputs that we're taking have to be driven in many cases from the bottom up, not from the top down, and focused on the fact that there is unique sets of factors in individual parts of the world that require different priorities and attention. And ultimately, foreign policy, mature foreign policy, requires a balancing of interests. That's just a fact. Okay, our human rights agenda is going to look different in certain parts of the world than it will in others. That doesn't mean that we as a people have abandoned it. That means that in a world where you need to conduct real foreign policy in a mature and structured way, there are ways you're going to have to balance all these.
Actually, Senator Rubio, we're making progress. There's protesting in English now.
Oh, remember that? Yeah.
Remember last time.
So we have to understand, and that's why we think it's so important that our regional bureaus be at the core and at the heart of everything we do. And so we feel good about that part of it. By the same token, I think critical to this are some of the reforms we're trying to make to foreign aid. And I said when I appeared before this committee, everything we do has to make us stronger, safer, or more prosperous. So we've undertaken a review of our foreign aid. And the reality is that there are many of these programs, some are good programs. Some make all the sense in the world, and we wanted to pursue those programs.
Go ahead.
Some of these programs make all the sense in the world, but frankly, on the priority scale, perhaps other programs were more important. Others, frankly, made no sense at all. We can talk about some of those programs today. We funded things around the world that made absolutely no sense. I will say this, even with the reforms we put in place and what we're suggesting as changes to our foreign aid, we still will provide more foreign aid, more humanitarian support than the next 10 countries combined, than the entire OECD, and far more than China. China doesn't do humanitarian aid. China does predatory lending. That's what Belt and Road Initiative is. That's what all of their aid. They have zero record of doing humanitarian aid in the world. And frankly, they don't know how to do it. They have no interest in doing it. What they're very good at is going into some country, making you a loan, and then holding that debt over your head. And that's what they continue doing. By the way, you have to hire a Chinese company to do it. So I don't agree with this assessment that there's no evidence whatsoever that China has either the capacity or the will to replace the U.S. in humanitarian assistance, in food deliveries, or in developmental assistance for that matter. We provide development assistance. They provide debt traps. And that's a point over and over again around the world that we've made, and we found receptive audiences to it. Now look, anytime you undertake reforms of this magnitude that needed to be made, you're going to have hiccups and you're also going to have controversy. But these reforms had to happen. At USAID, 12 cents of every dollar was reaching the recipient. That means that in order for us to get aid to somebody, we had to spend all this other money supporting this foreign aid industrial complex. We're going to find more efficient ways to deliver aid to people directly, and it's going to be directed by our regional bureaus, and it's going to sponsor programs that make a difference, and it's going to be part of a holistic approach to our foreign policy. And I look forward to engaging with this committee and the appropriators as well, and ensuring that we get to the right place on that. My last point I would make is this is something I am very proud of. I believe, and I'm not besmirching anyone else, but I believe that the approach we have taken at the State Department, and frankly at USAID, but at State Department, to move forward reforms that involved intake from all of our partners, that required input from people within the building. Many of the reforms we've made were driven by people inside the building, many of whom have worked there for 20 or 30 years. And now we are engaged with Congress, both in the House and Senate, in a comment period where we're taking many of your comments and are making changes to our organizational proposals that we look forward to bringing back to you with an official congressional notification. And even after that, there'll be an opportunity to move forward. But the State Department had to change. I'm telling you, it was no longer at the center of American foreign policy. It had often been replaced by the National Security Council or by some other agency of government, when in fact we have these highly talented people, who many of whom have served in multiple posts around the world and have a holistic view of how foreign policy needs to be conducted, that were being edged out. Because you know what? When I get a decision memo early on at the State Department and they would hand me these memos, there were 40 boxes on this piece of paper. That means 40 people had to check off, yes, okay, before it even got to me. That's ridiculous. That takes too long. That's why people said, don't use State Department. They take too long and it's too cumbersome. And if any one of those little boxes didn't get checked, the memo didn't move up the chain. That can't continue. We can't move at that pace in this world. Events happen quickly, and we have to be able to move at the pace of relevance. And so I hope to work with you in a productive way to make that possible. You're not going to like all the changes, but I want you to know what the intent of the changes are. It is not to dismantle American foreign policy, and it is not to withdraw us from the world. Because I just hit 18 countries in 18 weeks. That doesn't sound like much of a withdrawal. And I see some of these foreign ministers, including individuals from Ukraine, more than I've seen my own children. And I talk to them at least 3 times a week. We are engaged in the world, but we're going to be engaged in a world that makes sense and that's smart. And that isn't about saving money. It is about ensuring that we are delivering to our people what they deserve, a foreign policy that makes America stronger, safer, and more prosperous. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rubio. We're going to do a round of questions. We'll go 7 minutes since we have a secretary here. And I'm going to start. One of the things that you mentioned, and admittedly, what we're dealing with here is a large number of subjects. I want to focus on one that Senator Shaheen and I have worked together on, and that's the Syria matter. Thank you and the President for suspending or lifting the sanctions on Syria. I think the next step, and I think you agree with us that both Syria and Lebanon are opportunities for us. And we need to explore the opportunities with a careful eye on what's going on to make sure it stays on track. I think the next step, as far as I'm concerned, as far as moving Syria forward, is getting personnel on the ground there. And you and I talked about the possibility of opening the embassy. And I understand that this isn't a classified setting, but can you maybe describe for us the challenges of opening the embassy, why we haven't done it to this point, staying within the bounds of the
Yeah, well, it's entirely driven by security concerns. By the way, it's not the transitional authorities. We don't think they would harm us, but there are other elements on the ground in Syria that we have to be able to protect our
important
people.
point.
And there are the ability, you don't just have to be able to get people in, you have to be able to get people out. We have all kinds of requirements that are there for a reason. If someone is hurt, do you have a medical evacuation plan? Can you secure a facility from an attack from an armed group, many of whom are still running loose in the country, unfortunately? It's one of the fundamental challenges the transitional authority is facing. On the broader point of Syria, I would say when Syria, if you look at the history of the region, when Syria is unstable, the region becomes unstable. And this has certainly been true after the Arab Spring led to the Assad rebellion against Assad, and that really destabilized the entire region. And then it turned Syria, frankly, into a playground for jihadist groups, including ISIS and others that used it to operate and to destabilize their partners. So you have this change in December. And my view, which I've discussed with many of you individually, is the bad news is that the transitional authority figures they didn't pass their background check with the FBI. Okay, they've got a tough history and one that we understand. But on the flip side of it is, if we engage them, it may work out, it may not work out. If we did not engage them, it was guaranteed to not work out. In fact, it is our assessment that, frankly, the transitional authority, given the challenges they're facing, are maybe weeks, not many months, away from potential collapse and a full-scale civil war of epic proportions, basically the country splitting up. The good news is that there is a Syrian national identity. It is one of the places in the Middle East where Alawis and Druze and Christians and Sunni and Shia have lived and Kurds have lived alongside each other underneath the banner of a Syrian identity until it was broken by a butcher, Assad, who pitted them against each other. So they face a number of challenges. The first is they are dealing with deep internal distrust in that country because Assad deliberately pitted these groups against each other. He claimed to be the protector of the Alawis and the Christians and pitted them against the Druze or whoever else he wanted to, and the result is a deep level of distrust. The second is the displacement, upwards of 6, 7, 8 million Syrians living abroad. Very successful, by the way, in the countries they go to. But they need to come. We need to figure out how we can enable the transitional authority to create an environment where they come back home, where they can come back to their homes, where they can help rebuild their economy. But what prompted the president to move quickly on sanctions? Because we had a plan. We engaged with the foreign minister at the UN here in New York. We gave them a visa to come into the country. We allowed their finance minister to come to World Bank meetings here in Washington, D.C. The next step was I was going to meet with the foreign minister, and some of you may have met with him already at Munich, but I was going to meet with him in Turkey at the NATO gathering. But the president had an opportunity to meet with al-Shara, and frankly, he made a bold decision. I'll do it. I'll meet with them under the Saudis and the Turks that encourage that. And the rationale and the reason is we need to, right now, the most important thing is that partnering nations, the nations in the region want to get aid in, want to start helping them, and they can't because they're afraid of our sanctions. So they don't. The lifting of the sanctions, its most immediate impact will be to allow neighboring countries to begin to assist the transitional authority to build governance mechanisms that allow them to actually establish a government, unify the armed forces under one banner and the like. But I want to be frank, that won't be enough. With the Caesar Act, we can issue waivers, but these waivers, because of expirations on them, are not going to attract the kind of foreign investment. Ultimately, there's going to have to be something done congressionally or more comprehensively to ensure that if the right steps are taken, we can create an environment for private sector growth that begins to provide economic opportunity to the people of Syria. But one last point I would make is the outcome in Syria will have a deep impact on what happens inside of Lebanon, because Lebanon too has been hurt by a combination of clashes at the border, but also they've had to assume responsibility for some of these Syrian refugees.
We believe that, by the way.
So the combination, if you think about a region, let's say 2 years from now, where Syria and Lebanon are stable, that opens up incredible opportunities around the region for all kinds of peace and security and the end of conflicts and wars. Obviously, this is a big task. It's big picture thinking, but it's a historic opportunity and one that we are obligated to try to explore and see if we can make it work.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I think we're in full agreement with this, and it is a conundrum as far as the sanctions are concerned. We've got the 6 month, but as you say, the future it's hard to predict the future since it hasn't happened yet, as Yogi Berra used to say. And there are real issues and risks in the future. We can take it a step at a time. You issued a visa to the foreign minister. Senator Shaheen and I met with the foreign minister in Munich. You issued him a visa to come to New York, which was important to meet with other heads of state. Do you have the ability to do that for the president also?
Sure. I mean, we could, and there may be an opportunity to do that come the General Assembly of the United Nations.
Yeah, probably will be, and I think that's important. Let me, we do hear a lot of complaining and renting of garments over cuts here and there on our foreign assistance, but the number you laid out is absolutely stunning. That the United States contributes more to foreign aid than the next 10 countries put together. I mean, that's an absolutely stunning number. So I guess what you're telling us before we feel too guilty about it, that we need to look around and compliment ourselves for what we are actually doing and have been doing for a long time. Fair statement?
Yeah, there's no doubt. And we want to do it in a smarter, more targeted way.
Yeah. Lastly, let me give you a minute on PEPFAR. People talk a lot about the cutting in PEPFAR. And I think virtually everyone here supports PEPFAR. But you've done some things to it to make it better. Can you give us a short dissertation on that? Very short, please.
85% of PEPFAR is functional right now. I know there was some hiccups on the payment systems, not the waivers, the payment systems, because it goes to Treasury. Treasury has to push the money out. And there were some hiccups, which I acknowledged in conversations with many of you, but we have fixed that program and the money's flowing. So 85% of PEPFAR is functioning and is operating. There was reduction in about 15% of or individual pieces of the program, but PEPFAR today stands at 85% of functionality. And when I hear these stories about, well, the money's like, we're moving money out of the building every single day, 20 million one day, 35 million the other. I mean, money is moving out the door. It's going to somebody. Some of it is going to pay for work that was conducted in December, January, February before the freeze. So we are paying back invoices on some of them. But most of it, a lot of it, is going towards ongoing programmatic activities that are approved and that we've either through a waiver and or approval process are moving forward on.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I have a number of questions, but I first want to go back to what you had to say about China, because I agree that their efforts are predatory. But I think somebody may be missing what they are doing in response to our ceasing of foreign assistance in places. And Mr. Chairman, for the record, I'd like to submit this fact sheet. The PRC supporting international assistance as U.S. withdraws. It's dated April 29th. And just to give you a few examples, earlier this month, General Michael Langley, who's the commander of U.S. Africa Command, I sit on the Armed Services Committee, and when we asked him about the end to specific USAID programs, he stated that the PRC is trying to replicate, in quotes, specific USAID programs in Africa that the Trump administration cut, including PEPFAR. And I mean, there are several pages of these examples. Another one is in Cambodia. After the U.S. terminated $2 million in demining programming in Cambodia, the PRC immediately announced $4.4 million to expand its own demining programs. The PRC also recently stepped in to fund child literacy and nutrition programs previously supported by USAID. So we can pretend that China is not doing these things and picking up and promoting themselves as a reliable partner when the United States is not. But we have specific examples that show where this is happening. But I want to move to Ukraine because we heard the conversation that the president had with Vladimir Putin, the phone conversation where Putin didn't agree to any meaningful negotiation that would end this war in Ukraine. As President Trump has admitted, Vladimir Putin is taking him for a ride. Now, we have a bipartisan bill in the Senate that's led by Lindsey Graham. It has 80 sponsors. I understand that the House members are ready to take this up on a discharge petition, if we pass it out of the Senate, how much longer until we rein Putin in? And are you prepared to support that sanctions bill that Graham and Blumenthal and 78 other members of the Senate support?
Well, let me answer your last question first, and that is about the bill. We obviously can't control what Congress does, and we've told the Russians this. Not now, 6-8 weeks ago. I believe, Senator Sheen, you were involved in a conversation that made it clear to the Russians what would happen if there was no progress made. And that's been repeated multiple times. I would also make this point, and it's important. Every single sanction, not one sanction has been lifted on the Russians. Every single sanction that was in place under the previous administration remains in place. So this idea we've given up leverage, well, the only we have the same leverage today we had under the previous administration.
Well,
now,
Mr. Secretary, I would argue that the leverage that we've given up is taking NATO membership off the table, taking away a commitment to continue to help the Ukrainians with intelligence sharing and with military equipment and arms that they need to help fight this war.
Well, that continues. There was a pause for 1 week. All of that was restarted.
That was intelligence sharing, though, but it doesn't cover the equipment and arms.
Oh, absolutely. That program has not been rescinded. They continue to receive armaments from the United States.
And we continue to fund what the Ukrainians need as the president. And are you prepared to pass another supplemental bill to support them?
Well, that's a different decision. That's a different question. That's not up for me to decide. The White House would have to make a determination about whether to come to Congress for a supplemental. But everything that's been approved and congressionally appropriated is ongoing. In fact, to the extent that the Ukrainians have asked for anything additional, what they've asked for is air defenses, Patriot units, which frankly we don't have. But we are working closely with our NATO allies. There are NATO allies that do have some batteries of Patriot missiles that they could provide or transfer over to the Ukrainians to defend, for example, the airspace of Kyiv and other places. And we've been encouraging in that front and working alongside our partners there to get deliveries of some of these systems. As you can imagine, none of these countries want to give up their Patriot systems either. But we can't make them fast enough. And part of the challenge we have in Ukraine is that munitions are being expended substantially faster than the ability of the broader West, not just us, but the West, to produce them. Now, that said, on the issue of Ukraine, here's what we can all agree on. There is no military solution to this crisis.
Right.
It will have to end in a negotiated settlement. And the fundamental challenge we have in Ukraine is this. Russia wants what they do not currently have and are not entitled to, and Ukraine wants what they cannot regain militarily. And that's been the crux of the challenge.
I don't disagree with that at one level, but on the other hand, what Vladimir Putin is doing now is playing for time, and he's playing this president like a fiddle. And the longer he plays it, the more opportunity he has to gain territory in Ukraine, and the harder it's going to be to get him to the table. But what we need to do is to put pressure on Vladimir Putin in every way we can to ensure that we can get them to the negotiating table.
Well, I disagree with this playing with a fiddle analogy, because the truth of the matter is when Vladimir Putin woke up this morning, he had the same set of sanctions on him that he's always had since the beginning of this conflict, and Ukraine was still getting armaments and shipments from us and from our allies, and the European Union is about to impose additional sanctions, and the U.S. is looking for no Patriot batteries to be able to transfer from other NATO nations into Ukrainian hands. And what the president's trying to do is end a war. He's trying to end a bloody, costly war that neither side can win, and people are dying every single day. But this notion that what has Putin gained throughout this? He hasn't gotten a single concession. He hasn't gotten a single sanction lifted.
And the more time he gets without additional pressure on Russia, the more incentive he's got to continue to gain territory and continue to play for time. But I want to just get to a final question because my time is running out. And that is, I recently wrote a letter to you about the issuance of executive orders on thousands of Afghan allies. These are people who fought alongside our military during the war in Afghanistan. They've been stranded in Qatar and Albania and Pakistan and Afghanistan. These are individuals who have been vetted already. They're ready to travel to the United States. And the question I have is this administration going to allow them to come to the United States as it promised? Because unless we're willing to keep our commitments to those people who were willing to fight and die alongside of us, then how can we ever ask people to do that again?
Yeah, a couple points. Some of those are I think the issues that is getting mixed up here is whether we are going to pay for them to fly to the United States once a visa is issued, or whether they have to find their own transportation to the U.S. So there's two separate topics: our payment to move people forward, but also the issuance of the visas. And when that is still going through an internal review as to who is going to be allowed in, there's been a review of the vetting process that's been used. Frankly, there have been some errors found in the previous vetting process that we're concerned about, and I'm separating out from that audience people who we have closely vetted because we've been working alongside them for many years with regards to their service alongside our intelligence forces or special operators on the ground from the broader. Remember, they're also bringing dependents with them. And so there were some concerns early on about freezing or slowing down this program until we could determine whether we were properly vetting people to come towards the United States. And that process is ongoing, and I think we'll have more concrete answers for you, which I know is not satisfactory at this moment, but we've obviously had a lot going on. But this is something that we've heard a lot from both our DoD partners and others in the intelligence community, and we're working to make progress on that.
I'm out of time, but just to clarify, on last week, Secretary Noem announced that temporary protected status, which I understand is not exactly the same, but for over 8,000 Afghans would end on July 12th. Many of those people are people, again, who fought and died alongside of our men and women in the military. And for us to send them back to sure death at the hands of the Taliban is just not what they were promised when they agreed to fight with us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Senator Ricketts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Rubio, welcome. The United States is at its most dangerous time in our history since World War II. And we know, we can see what Russia's done in Europe. We know the increasing aggression of communist China, Iran, North Korea. I want to hit upon Iran real quickly here. As you know, this is a theocracy that's got brutal mullahs and a corrupt military. They chant death to America, death to Israel. You've had 4 rounds of negotiations with them so far, and I think you framed it best when you said earlier this month they have to walk away from sponsoring terrorists, they have to walk away from helping Houthis, they have to walk away from building long-range missiles that have no purpose to exist other than having nuclear weapons, and they have to walk away from enrichment. That was your quote earlier. And that enrichment is particularly important, as you've stated, and Steve Witkoff reemphasized over the weekend, the ability to enrich at 3.67% for a civilian program. It only takes a few weeks to get to 90% for a military-grade weapon. Now, what I'd like you to just talk about real briefly is, what are you thinking about when you say they've got to get rid of their nuclear program, they've got to have complete disarmament? Is it still the policy that they cannot be allowed to enrich at all in Iran?
Thank you. Well, obviously, these are ongoing, I hope to be ongoing negotiations, because the alternative would be far worse, in my view, but maybe necessary. But we hope that we can reach an agreement with Iran. So here's the baseline that I've described to everybody on it. If what Iran wants is a civil nuclear program, energy, you know, the ability to develop nuclear energy, there's a model for that multiple countries around the world currently follow. And that allows them to build reactors and then bring in enriched material and use it to generate electricity. And that's a model that will be available to Iran potentially if they choose to take it. If, on the other hand, they want to retain enrichment capability. And I just described this because if anyone's watching this or in the future, this can get a little complex. All of you understand it, but for the general public, it's important when you get into the details of this. Once you know how to enrich at any level, all you need is time to be able to enrich at a higher level. And they've already proven the ability to enrich at a higher level. In fact, they have and are doing so now. In fact, their legislative branch passed a law requiring them to break JCPOA and enrich way beyond, almost well beyond 60%. So you're absolutely right. About 90% of the work of enrichment is getting to that 3.67 level. After that, the rest of it is just a matter of time, not to mention what the gap is from the 20% for medical isotopes, which is the other thing they insist upon. So the Iranian position is that they don't just want energy. They claim that enrichment is a matter of national pride. It is our view that they want enrichment as a deterrent. They believe that it makes them a threshold nuclear power and as a result becomes untouchable. And that is the crux of the situation we're facing right now. And there are other actors, and I won't go much deeper into it, but there are other nation states in the region that are also range from uncomfortable all the way to view as an existential threat the belief that Iran could ever be in a position of maintaining its enrichment capability in the long term that could quickly be weaponized. So that is the basis upon which we are negotiating with the Iranians. Our hope is that we can encourage them to show them a path towards prosperity and peace that allow them to develop their economy, that allow them, if they want, to have a civil nuclear energy program like other countries around the world have without enrichment. And it's our hope we can encourage them in that direction. The president has been very clear, and I won't elaborate any further, that they are never going to get a nuclear weapon. That is not going to happen. But I much prefer, and I would venture to guess all of you would much prefer, if we could reach an arrangement where they agree to this off-ramp, to this pathway towards prosperity and peace, as opposed to the road they have been on for the last 20 years. And it will not be easy, but that's the process we're engaged in now.
Right, thanks. So let's go to communist China, because they're the greatest existential threat that we face as a nation. We both agreed last time you were before this committee that we need an all-of-government, not just an all-government, but we also need an all-of-society approach on how we face communist China. This was illustrated in a recent tabletop exercise that I did with Sarah Coons and others in them, talking about contingency where Beijing tries to do an energy quarantine on Taiwan to force them to capitulate. And obviously unlocking Americans' energy is one of the ways that we can help counter this with LNG and biofuels, some of our strongest tools to be able to help our allies and partners. Cutting red tape, unleashing American energy in the private sector, we're positioned to be an energy supplier here of choice. But we need the infrastructure in place, and that includes having a West Coast LNG terminal. Can you talk a little bit about what you're thinking about when it comes to this type of contingency with regard to an energy quarantine in Taiwan and how the administration would approach that?
Well, first of all, it would be devastating. The U.S., as you know, has agreements in place and assurances it's made on maintaining the status quo in that region, and those will remain viable without trying to be alarmist here. We know what those are, and we hope that never happens. But I think the broader issue that you touch upon, which I don't think is widely understood, again, members of the committee who follows this closely understand it, but more broadly, is the dangerous imbalance that has developed between China and the rest of the world on a number of fronts. The first is on access to rare earth minerals, which they have secured access rights all over the world on virtually every continent. They are predominant and or leading in their access. And it's one of the points of frustration that I have. You go to a country and you see how much money we've given in humanitarian aid, but when it comes to rare earth mineral rights and exploited, rights to natural resources, it's all on the Chinese side. So where's the connection between the aid we give to help countries survive and the fact that the Chinese are going in and somehow from these governments, bribery or otherwise, getting a hold of all these rare earth minerals and leases and contracts all over the place, not just in Africa, in Latin America, all over the place. The second is processing. They process all these rare earth elements. So we are literally, if they decide one day we're going to cut the world off, and they've threatened to do so to some extent with these trade negotiations, you won't be able to build an engine in this country. You won't be able to build a rocket or any of the things that we use in daily life. This is a very dangerous situation that's developed that has to be addressed as well. A lot of it will require domestic changes in our own country and building up our own domestic capabilities, for example, to refine rare earth minerals and to process, but also just to make things. Pharmaceuticals, another dangerous imbalance. We were, all this talk about them getting close to the Europeans, they're dumping on the European market. They're dumping electric cars. They're dumping all kinds of products because they're overproducing. They don't consume. So they dump all these products onto the European marketplace. But you know what the Europeans are very concerned about? The Italians in particular. They used to lead the world in pharmaceuticals, at least in the precursors and the key elements and the basic ingredients. Now the Chinese dominate 80-something% of that industry. They could cut off our medicine. So I think when you talk about energy, I could apply that to a host of critical industries in the 21st century. If we don't address that imbalance, which is what we're hoping to do with some of the trade proposals, but also domestic matters that the administration is taking on, we're going to be in real tough shape here very soon if we're not already.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I see my time is up, but I look forward to continuing to talk with you about how we can create this all-society strategy to be able to fight back against communist China, because you just laid out a lot of the things that we're at risk at, and we have to have a way to be able to push back on them so that they don't decide to try to take Taiwan by force or try to do an energy quarantine, which could lead to a war which would be devastating for everybody. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. A sobering analysis of where we are on the supply chain. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Thank you, Secretary Rubio. Look forward to 2 sessions together today. This afternoon, you'll be in front of the Appropriations Subcommittee. And I think there's going to be some themes across both of these. First, I think we all agree that China poses our single greatest geopolitical threat, and that we have no choice but to deter China across the board and to outcompete China. Senator Ricketts and I just traveled to the Philippines and Taiwan and saw directly the challenges that we face there and regionally. And you've recently had some significant successes, the DRC, Rwanda peace transition, the avoidance of escalation in India and Pakistan, the opening towards Syria. But I also frankly think that there's been a real lack of coordination and some serious harm to our standing in the world with some of the countries that we have worked most closely with over decades. The DOGE-driven, abrupt, and largely illegal cancellation of billions of dollars of contracts for humanitarian relief and aid, and the disrespect and the dismissal of thousands of AID staff and our NGO partners stands in sharp contrast to the state reorganization process you just presented on in your following. You've submitted plans and proposals. We're having a conversation. You're going to send a congressional notification. We're going to have a hearing. That's the way that the reforming of USAID could have and should have happened. And so I just at the outset had to say, as someone who spent 15 years traveling the world, visiting both our partners and allies, looking at independent or semi-independent agencies like the MCC and the DFC and their role, and visiting NGO partners and the USAID, I reject the broad characterization of them by Elon Musk and DOGE as criminals who were wasting taxpayer money. You've heard across all of us support for PEPFAR, concern about humanitarian relief, and the vision that this is a key strategic asset for us. It's my hope that we'll work together to actually make real a more effective, focused, and sustainable foreign aid component to what STAID does, and sustaining organizations that we help build together, like the MCC, the DFC, and the Global Fragility Act. So let me turn to this for a moment. My colleague, Senator Shaheen, made reference to places in the world where the CCP and the PRC have stepped forward. I agree, they're never going to deliver humanitarian aid the way we used to, and with the breadth, depth, and effectiveness that we have. But I also think they're taking advantage of the opening to say that we're not reliable, that our decades-long partnerships can't be sustained and extended, and to question our motivations. So I think we need to step out quickly to avoid creating a big hole in our credibility globally. Let me just start on a few questions with Ukraine. The previous administration worked closely with our partners and allies in Europe on sanctions to tighten them, to close loopholes, to extend designations. Are you continuing to do that?
Work with our allies?
To tighten the sanctions?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, the Europeans have their own set of sanctions, and we've coordinated with them very closely. In fact, the president had a call with at least 6 leaders from Europe yesterday. I had meetings with what we call the Quint, that include Italy, Italy, France, the UK, the Germans, the French. So we are in constant contact with them on the work that they're doing. And they're proceeding along their own route. And in fact, in our conversations in the past with the Russians, we made clear to them that the Europeans and ultimately will have to be at the table because they have their own set of sanctions that they're imposing. So the answer to your question is we have worked very closely with them. The president understands fully the options he has available to him, some of which are represented in the bill before the Senate.
In the bill before the Senate that Senator Graham and others have led and that I co-sponsor, I think we have an opportunity to put more pressure on Russia and to push Putin to get to the table and to agree to a just and enduring peace. Do you support that sanctions bill? And do you think we should continue to arm Ukraine and to strengthen the sanctions against Ukraine in order to create the conditions for a real negotiation?
Yeah, look, it may come to that point. If in fact it is clear that the Russians are not interested in a peace deal and they just want to keep fighting a war, it may very well come to that point. The president has made that in the past. Our belief, the president's belief, is he believes that right now, if you start threatening sanctions, the Russians will stop talking. And there's value in us being able to talk to them and drive them to get to the table. We'll see. Look, they have to do this. No one's claiming that this is a guarantee.
President Zelensky reversed himself, showed up, was ready and willing to negotiate. And Putin, I think, my view, continues to play for time.
Well, so
I hope that we can work together to put more pressure on Putin to get to the table and to resolve this. The other thing that I see clearly, and I think many of my colleagues do, is that what happens in Ukraine sets the table for what happens in the Indo-Pacific. That there's an increasing coordination between the Russians, the Iranians, the DPRK, and the PRC. Do you see that as well, Mr. Secretary?
Well, we remind our European allies every day that were it not for China, Russia would not be able to sustain this. And they're fully aware of that. And obviously, we all understand the presence of the North Koreans and the Iranian role in this as well. But by the same token, I would say there's a flip side to that, and that is every minute we spend, every dollar we spend on this conflict in Europe is distracting both our focus and our resources away from a potential for a much more serious, much more cataclysmic confrontation in the Indo-Pacific. So the answer is yes, they are related, but they're related both ways. They're related on the one hand by the precedent that it could set, but they're also related by the fact that every minute that we spend on this conflict that cannot be won by military means, every resource that's expended into it is money and time that's not being spent on preventing a much more serious confrontation from a global perspective in the Indo-Pacific.
You made the point earlier that, in your view, we did not coordinate well enough between countries where we for decades had done humanitarian aid, disaster relief, public health work, and countries that ally with China in terms of resource mining and processing. One of the countries we visited was the Philippines. The Philippines is the most disaster-prone country on Earth. They have more typhoons, volcanoes, earthquakes than anywhere else, and they are a treaty ally of the United States. Yet we abruptly canceled a whole series of programs that provided disaster assistance, development assistance, and humanitarian aid. My hope is that we will work together to follow an appropriate and legal process to reform foreign aid and to align it with our values and priorities. I've long seen the MCC and the DFC as critical components in pushing back on what you correctly perceive as the PRC's extractive engagement with much of their region. What do you see as the future for organizations like the MCC and the DFC? And when we next speak this afternoon, I'll be pressing you on the America First Opportunity Fund and understanding how this nearly $3 billion Agile fund will fit into the picture for the future of aid.
Yeah, on DFC, we don't control those two entities. They're independent. They're both undergoing a review. DFC, I think, has the opportunity to potentially even expand. That's not a commitment, but I'm telling you there's talk about that. On Millennium Challenge, I think that I saw some reporting out there that it was being imploded. My understanding is the way it's being approached is that it's being reformed but not done away with. It was actually created as an alternative to the way we did aid with USAID. And so there's work happening on both of them. So my personal view on DFC is I think DFC has an opportunity to perhaps do more. And it's the sort of investment we want to make around the world in the way it's structured. And on Millennium Challenge, it's undergoing a review right now, but the review is designed to improve it, not to eliminate it.
Well, we should talk more directly about that. I'm concerned that what's happened in other agencies is happening there. The overwhelming majority of the headquarters staff being suspended or fired, and then compacts eliminated more quickly than